Ayatollah Khomeini. That name has been deeply etched into history as one of the most profoundly influential figures that the 20th century ever witnessed. From a cleric living in exile, he became the leader of the Iranian Revolution, overthrowing the monarchy that had lasted more than 2,500 years in Iran and giving birth to an entirely new political system, the Islamic Republic, on the 1st of February 1979. When he returned to Tehran after 15 years away from his homeland, around 5 to 6 million people poured into the streets to welcome him, a testament to his rare influence over the masses. Without his own army, without holding any state office throughout his time in exile, Khomeini was still able to lead a movement that changed the entire power structure of the country. He was not only a political leader but also a spiritual symbol, the one who shaped the idea of Vayate Faqih, the doctrine that placed supreme leadership in the hands of the clerics. Under his leadership, a new system was built. From the constitution and government apparatus to the Revolutionary Guard forces, all bearing his personal imprint. To many supporters, he was the one who restored religious identity and political independence to Iran, a symbol of resistance against Western influence and the embodiment of national will. But behind the image of that revered leader was a life shaped by loss and pain from the very early years. His father was assassinated when he was still a newborn baby, leaving a void that nothing could fill, and his mother also passed away when he was very young, making his childhood tied to emotional deprivation and early experiences of the fragility of life. His growing up years were not a journey of glory, but a series of harsh study days, strict discipline, and isolation in the religious world. When he began to speak out against the government, he was arrested, monitored, and finally forced to leave the country in 1964, opening more than a decade of exile in Turkey, Iraq, and then France. Throughout that period, he lived far from his family, far from his homeland, facing loneliness and uncertainty. But it was also during those years that his thoughts were forged. Those personal wounds, irreversible losses, and years pushed to the margins of society helped create a person of unshakable determination, someone who believed he was carrying out a mission greater than himself. And that very belief took him from an exiled individual to the center of a revolution that changed the history of Iran. If you want to explore deeper into the turbulent story behind Ruhollah Khomeini, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next parts. Right from the beginning of his life, Ruhollah Khomeini was not born into a stable or safe world, but into an environment where local power, disputes, and violence were still part of everyday life in central Iran in the early 20th century. He was born in 1900, although some sources say 1902, in the town of Kalman, a relatively small area and not a major political center of the country. His family belonged to the Shia clerical class, a class that played a special role in Iranian society, not only as religious guides but also as those with influence in ethics and law within the community. His father, Mustafa Mousavi, was a respected cleric in the area, known as a defender of the local people's interests against feudal forces and landlords. However, this very role also put him in a dangerous position. Around 1903, when Khomeini was still a newborn baby, Mustafa Mousavi was assassinated in a dispute involving power and land, most likely related to local landlords. His father's death was not only a personal loss, but also an event that profoundly shaped the family's circumstances, causing Khomeini to grow up in an environment where violence was not something distant, but a reality tied to power. After his father's death, Khomeini's family had to rely on other relatives to survive. His mother, Hajar Aga Khanum, was the one who directly raised him in the early years, but she also passed away when he was still young, leaving Khomeini in a state of lacking both father and mother from a very early age. His childhood years were therefore not tied to stability or a complete family affection, but to dependence on his older brother and other members of the lineage. His family claimed to have origins from the lineage of Imam Musa al-Qadim, one of the 12 Imams of Shia Islam, and this not only carried religious significance but also created a sense of position and responsibility in society. In that context, Khomeini was not only raised like a normal child, but like an heir to a long religious tradition, With clear expectations about his future role, Khomeini's education process began very early, mainly under the guidance of his family and local clerics. He was taught to read and understand the Quran, to learn the basic principles of Islamic law and lectures on ethics. This educational environment was highly disciplined, emphasizing obedience, patience, and self-control. Unlike large urban centers where there was a mix of many different ideas, Khomeini was a relatively closed environment where religion dominated almost all aspects of life. This contributed to creating a solid but also conservative ideological foundation, where traditional values were maintained and reinforced through each generation. In his teenage years, Khomeini began to show a deep interest in religious studies, not in an explosive or standout way, but in a persistent and consistent direction. He was not recorded as a person with a rebellious personality or participating in large-scale social activities during this period, but mainly focused on learning and inner development. The influence of his older brother and other relatives in the family played an important role in directing this path, especially since they all belonged to the clerical class or had close ties to religious centers. The losses from very early in life, especially his father's death in a violent context, and his mother's departure when he was young, created a profound awareness of the fragility of life and the connection between power and injustice. These experiences were not immediately expressed through actions or public statements, but gradually formed a worldview in which social order was not always fair, and power could determine human destiny. In an environment where religion provided not only faith but also a framework to explain all events, Khomeini grew up with a value system in which ethics, power, and personal responsibility were closely linked, laying the foundation for his choices and actions in the later stages of his life. Step into the 1920s, after the initial years of study at his hometown, Ruhollah Khomeini left Qom and moved to Qom, where it was gradually becoming the most important theological center of Iran. The move to Qom was not a random choice, but almost an inevitable step for anyone pursuing an academic path in the Shia clerical circle. This city, especially after being strengthened by great scholars, had become the concentration of religious schools, where young people could access the deepest currents of thought in 12 Shia Islam. In that environment, Khomeini was no longer a child mainly influenced by his family, but began to enter a structured, disciplined, and highly competitive academic system. At Qom, he studied under the guidance of reputable scholars, among whom the prominent one was Abdul Karim Hari Yazdi, who re-established the theological center of Qom in the early 20th century. Hari Yazdi was not only a cleric, but also the one who laid the foundation for a more modern approach to training Shia clerics, combining tradition with systematization of knowledge. Under his influence, Khomeini received systematic training in Sharia law, the principles of fiqh, Islamic law, as well as fields of Islamic philosophy and theology. These were not simple fields, but required the ability for abstract thinking, logical analysis, and patience in approaching classical texts. Khomeini was not recorded as the most outstanding among the students, but he demonstrated perseverance and high concentration ability, which helped him progress steadily through each stage of study. Besides studying law and theology, Khomeini also spent a lot of time researching Islamic philosophy, including the works of philosophers such as Mullah Sadra, who had combined Greek philosophy and Islamic thought to build a synthetic philosophical system. Approaching these ideas helped Khomeini not only understand religion at the level of rules, but also at the philosophical depth, where questions about the nature of power, justice, and the role of human beings in society were raised. This was an important difference compared to many other clerics who only focused on law and rituals. Khomeini began to view religion not only as a system of personal belief, but as a structure that could organize and regulate society. During this period, he did not actively participate in politics. The 1920s and 1930s were a time when Iran went through many upheavals under the rule of Reza Shah, who pursued a policy of secularization and restricted the influence of the clerical class. However, Khomeini did not emerge as a public critic during this period. Instead, he focused on teaching and writing books, building an academic foundation and reputation within the clerical circle. He began teaching subjects such as Islamic ethics, philosophy, and Sharia law to younger students, while also writing research works on theology and philosophy. These activities did not create much attention from the outside, but helped him build a solid position within the religious community. It was precisely in this process of teaching and research that Khomeini's thinking gradually developed in a clearer direction. He began to question the real role of religion in a society that was changing rapidly under the influence of modernization and westernization. For him, separating religion from politics was not a solution, but a weakening of the social order. He believed that Sharia law was not just a set of rules for personal life, but had to be the foundation for the entire governance system. This view had not yet been presented systematically during this period, but it appeared in his lectures and thoughts, showing a shift from a pure scholar to someone forming a broader vision of society. Besides that, Khomeini also began to define more clearly the role of the clerical class. While many traditional clerics chose to stay out of politics, focusing on teaching and guiding believers, he gradually came to the conclusion that this was not enough to protect religious values in a society being influenced by external forces. He saw the danger when political power lay entirely in the hands of those not bound by religious law, and from there began to form the view that clerics should not only be spiritual guides, but also have a direct role in running the state. This process took place slowly, without breakthrough statements or attention-grabbing actions, but it was accumulative and sustainable. The years at Qom created a foundation that would later allow Khomeini not only to participate in politics, but also to reshape the way an entire nation operated. What he learned, taught, and thought during this period was not just knowledge but the basis for a system of thought that would be put into practice in the following decades. While Ruhollah Khomeini spent his years at Qom studying, teaching, and gradually forming his own thinking about the role of religion, outside the walls of the theological schools, Iran was undergoing a profound transformation in politics and society. In 1925, after a military coup, Reza Shah Pahlavi officially ended the Qajar dynasty and established the Pahlavi dynasty, opening a new phase in Iran's history with the goal of building a modern state modeled after the West. Reza Shah carried out a series of reforms aimed at centralizing power, reducing the influence of local landlords, and especially limiting the role of the clerical class in public life. He promoted the secularization of society, educational reforms, infrastructure building, and encouraged an image of Iran that was more national and modern rather than traditional religious. However, these reforms did not always receive consensus, especially from religious communities that viewed traditional values as the foundation of society. In 1941, in the context of World War II, Iran was invaded by British and Soviet forces due to concerns about its strategic position and the possibility of leaning toward Nazi Germany. Reza Shah was forced to abdicate, and his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, ascended to the throne at the age of only 21. Initially, the power of the young Shah was limited by the presence of foreign powers, but after the war ended, he gradually consolidated his position and began to build a more personalized model of rule. In the 1950s and 1960s, especially after the 1953 coup with the support of the CIA and MI6 aimed at overthrowing Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, the Shah became the central figure in Iran's political system, with nearly absolute power. One of the most important moves by Mohammad Reza Shah was the reform program called the White Revolution, announced in 1963. This was a series of policies aimed at modernizing Iran, including land reform, expanding voting rights for women, developing industry and education, as well as reducing the influence of the landlord class and clerics. For many people in the West, this was a sign that Iran was moving closer to a modern, developed society friendly to liberal values. However, for many inside the country, especially the religious circles, these reforms were seen as an intrusion of Western culture and a direct threat to traditional values and long-standing social structures. To maintain power and control opposing forces, the Shah established a strong internal security system in which the prominent organization was SAVAK, founded in 1957 with the support of American and Israeli intelligence agencies. Savvikar was not only an intelligence agency but also the main tool to monitor, control, and suppress any form of opposition to the regime. This organization had the right to arrest without trial, conduct interrogations, and in many cases use torture measures to extract information. The presence of Savak created an atmosphere of fear in society, where opposition political activities were strictly restricted and people had to think carefully before expressing personal opinions. In the broader context of the Cold War, Iran under the Shah became an important strategic ally of the United States in the Middle East. With its geographical position located between the Soviet Union and oil-rich regions, Iran played an important role as a key anchor in the strategy to contain Soviet influence. The United States provided economic, military, and technical support to Iran, while viewing the Shah as a reliable partner in the region. This helped Iran achieve a significant level of economic growth in some periods, especially thanks to oil revenue. However, the close relationship with the West also increased suspicion and opposition among the portion of the population who saw it as a sign of dependence and loss of national sovereignty. The combination of rapid modernization, tight political control, and growing Western influence created deep contradictions in Iranian society. On one hand, a new emerging middle class, benefiting from education and economic opportunities, supported the reforms and saw Iran's future in integration with the modern world. On the other hand, traditional communities, especially the clerics and those living in rural areas, felt marginalized and worried that their religious and cultural values were being eroded. It was precisely in the growing gap between these two worlds, one side Western-style modernization, the other protecting religious traditions, that social tensions began to accumulate. For people like Khomeini, these developments were not just policy changes, but signs of a profound shift in the nature of the Iranian state. As political power became increasingly detached from religious principles, and as control tools like Savak were used to maintain order, questions about the legitimacy of the system became increasingly clear. While many still accepted or even supported the path of modernization, another portion began to seek different explanations about how society should be organized and the role of religion in shaping state power. It was in this context that the ideas Khomeini had begun to form during his years of study and teaching at Qom gradually found an environment where they could be heard, discussed, and ultimately transformed into action. In the context of increasingly growing social contradictions between the process of modernization and traditional values, Ruhollah Khomeini was no longer just a religious scholar standing on the sidelines of the country's upheavals, but began to step into a more public role in opposing the government of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. June of 1963 marked an important turning point when Khomeini publicly criticized the Shah's policies, especially the White Revolution program, which he argued not only weakened traditional social structures, but also paved the way for growing American influence in Iran. In his lectures and speeches at Qom, he condemned the presence of the West as a factor eroding the country's religious and cultural identity, while questioning the legitimacy of a government that in his view had lost its connection to Islamic values. These statements quickly attracted the attention of the authorities, especially in the context where the Shah was trying to consolidate power and limit all forms of opposition. On the 5th of June 1963, Khomeini was arrested by security forces, an action taken to prevent his growing influence among the clerics and the believer community. However, this arrest did not reduce tensions but instead became a catalyst for a series of large protests in Tehran and Qom. Thousands of people took to the streets to protest, not only to demand Khomeini's release but also to express dissatisfaction with government policies. The protests quickly escalated, and the government responded by deploying the army to control the situation. In the following days, clashes between protesters and security forces led to significant casualties. Hundreds of people were reported to have died in the suppressions, although the exact number remains disputed. These events not only increased dissatisfaction in society, but also turned Khomeini from a relatively little-known scholar into a symbol of resistance in the eyes of many people. For a portion of the population, especially in religious circles, he began to be seen as someone who dared to speak out against power, a representative of the values they believed were being threatened. After a period of detention, Khomeini was released, but the 1963 events clearly changed his position. He was no longer just a cleric teaching within the scope of calm, but became a figure with influence in broader discussions about Iran's future. In lectures after his release, he continued to criticize the government, not only about specific policies but also about the overall direction of the country. He emphasized that separating religion from politics was not only a mistake but also a danger to social order, and that clerics had a responsibility not only in spiritual guidance but also in protecting the moral principles of society. The government, through agencies like Savak, began to monitor Khomeini's activities more closely. His lectures were recorded, his relationships were supervised, and any signs of his increasing influence were noted. In that context, Khomeini continued to operate, but with the clear awareness that he was in the sights of a security system designed to control and suppress all forms of opposition. The tension between him and the government was no longer a personal or academic issue, but became part of a larger confrontation between two views of Iranian society. For many other clerics, the 1963 events were a warning about the risks of engaging in politics, and some chose to keep their distance from opposition activities to avoid repression. However, for Khomeini, what had happened seemed to reinforce the view that silence was not a feasible option. The arrest, the protests, and the government's response had shown that the issues he raised were not just theoretical, but had real impact on society. In the following years, he continued to speak and teach with an increasingly clear tone, not only criticizing specific policies but also questioning the foundation of the current power system. The increasing influence of Khomeini, combined with his unwillingness to adjust his stance, made the government increasingly view him as a serious threat. Unlike political opponents who could be eliminated through administrative or legal measures, Khomeini represented a different kind of challenge, a challenge based on belief, religious networks, and the ability to convey messages to a large portion of the population. This made controlling him more complicated, and at the same time raised a question for the government about how to deal with a figure whose influence was not easily limited within the traditional frameworks of state power. After the events of 1963, and being increasingly regarded by the government as a serious threat, Ruhollah Khomeini's path within Iranian territory gradually became untenable. By 1964, a new turning point occurred when he publicly opposed a law granting American military personnel in Iran immunity from Iranian law, an agreement that he argued undermined national sovereignty and placed the Iranian people in a lower position in their own country. These statements were not only religious or moral in nature, but directly challenged the strategic relationship between Mohammad Reza Pahlavi's government and the United States in the context of the Cold War. The government's response was swift. In November of 1964, Khomeini was arrested once again, but this time, instead of being detained inside the country, he was completely expelled from Iran. His first destination was Turkey, where he was placed under strict control. During his time there, he was not allowed to wear traditional clerical attire, a detail that showed the extent to which the government wanted to undermine his religious image. However, his time in Turkey lasted only about a year. By 1965, he was transferred to Najaf, a city in Iraq, home to one of the most important Shia theological centers in the world. There he entered a period of exile lasting more than 14 years, a time long enough to completely change the way he approached his role. In Najaf, Khomeini was no longer limited by the direct constraints of the Iranian security system, but that did not mean he was completely free. The Iraqi government, under pressure from Iran, still monitored his activities, and the political environment there was also unstable. However, within that framework, he continued teaching at the theological schools, attracting an increasingly large group of students. His lectures were not only about Sharia law or Islamic philosophy, but increasingly focused on the role of religion in organizing society and political power. It was during this period that the ideas he had begun to form at Qom were developed more deeply and systematically. One of the notable features of this period was the way Khomeini maintained and expanded his influence into Iran despite living in exile. Through networks of students, clerics, and supporters, his lectures were recorded and secretly transferred into Iran in the form of cassette tapes. These recordings were then copied and widely distributed, especially in religious communities and traditional markets. This was a relatively new communication method at the time, allowing his message to cross borders and reach the people directly without going through official channels. The content of the lectures not only criticized the government but also presented a vision of an alternative system in which power belonged to those with religious knowledge. Meanwhile, Khomeini's family remained in Iran and lived under surveillance. Family members were not completely isolated, but their activities were closely monitored by security agencies. This created a clear separation between Khomeini's personal life and his public role, as he had to maintain contact with his family while continuing his teaching and dissemination of ideas from afar. This separation did not interrupt his activities but posed personal challenges, especially since he could not directly participate in family life for a long time. Throughout the years of exile, Khomeini did not participate in political organizations in the traditional sense, nor did he have an army or significant material resources. However, his influence not only did not decline, but showed signs of increasing. Part of the reason lay in the fact that he was no longer limited to the geographical scope of Iran, but could access wider religious networks in the Shia world. At the same time, domestic dissatisfaction with the Shah's government continued to accumulate, creating an environment in which his messages could be received and spread. The combination of continuous teaching, development of thought, and maintaining communication networks with Iran turned the exile period into an important phase in shaping Khomeini's role. Rather than weakening his position, the expulsion placed him in a position from which he could observe, analyze, and influence domestic developments without direct control. This created a paradox. A person not present in the country became one of the most influential figures in what was happening inside the country, and what began as the government's effort to eliminate an opposing voice gradually turned into a process through which that voice was amplified and spread further. Throughout the years living in the Jaf after being expelled, Ruhollah Khomeini not only maintained his teaching activities, but also gradually systematized the ideas that had formed earlier into a doctrine with a clearer structure. In the early 1970s, he began presenting a series of lectures later known as Vilayat-e-Faqih, a concept that laid the foundation for Islamic clerics holding supreme political power. The core content of this doctrine stated that in the period of the absence of the 12th Imam, a central figure in 12 Shia Islamic belief, leadership of the community should not belong to secular politicians, but must lie in the hands of those with deep religious knowledge and the ability to interpret Sharia law. This was not only a theological view but a direct proposal for the structure of state power, going against the existing political model in Iran under Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. These lectures were initially presented within the scope of classes at Najaf, but quickly extended beyond that space through being recorded and copied. The cassette tapes containing the lecture content were brought back to Iran by students and supporters, where they were duplicated and distributed through unofficial networks. In the context of media tightly controlled by agencies like SAVAK, this method allowed Khomeini's message to reach a large portion of the population without going through official channels. Traditional markets, mosques, and merchant networks became important transfer points where the recordings were exchanged, listened to, and continued to spread. The content of the lectures was not only theoretical but also directly related to the situation in Iran, from government policies to the role of religion in social life. The spread of these messages occurred in parallel with the increase in domestic dissatisfaction with the Shah's government, especially in the context of many economic and social fluctuations. For many people, what Khomeini presented was not only a system of thought, but also an explanation for what they were experiencing, as well as a proposal for a different path. His absence from Iran did not reduce the impact of these messages, but in some cases even increased attention, as his image was built as someone standing outside the current system, unbound by domestic political interests. However, Khomeini's presence in the Jaf was not always stable. By 1978, under pressure from the Iranian government, the Iraqi government began to restrict his activities. In that context, he decided to leave Iraq and seek another location to continue his work. After a short period of consideration, he moved to France and settled in Neaufle-Château, a small village near Paris. The choice of France, a Western country with a more open media environment, created a significant change in the way he approached the public. At Neauphle-le-Château, Khomeini was no longer limited to traditional religious networks. He began to engage with international press, answer interviews, and issue statements in various languages through interpreters. Major news agencies from Europe and the United States sent reporters to meet him, record his speeches, and broadcast his image to the world. This not only helped him reach the Iranian community inside the country and abroad, but also made him a figure known on an international scale. His messages, which had previously been transmitted mainly through cassette tapes, now appeared on television, newspapers, and global media channels. At the same time, domestic support networks continued to operate, connecting what he said from France with the situation unfolding in Iran. Protests, strikes, and social unrest increased throughout 1978, and Khomeini's statements from Neauphle-le-Château were often seen as direct responses or guidance for these developments. The combination of an international media center in France and a domestic information distribution network created an effective communication channel in which ideas were not only transmitted but also adjusted according to the actual situation. In those circumstances, Khomeini was no longer a cleric in exile in the traditional sense, but became a figure capable of influencing domestic events from outside. His absence from Iran did not prevent him from participating in political developments, but instead allowed him to operate in a space with less control, where messages could be transmitted quickly and widely. What began as lectures in a classroom in Najaf had transformed into a system of thought spread through various channels connecting people inside and outside Iran, and contributing to shaping a movement not limited by geographical borders. The final months of 1978 marked a period when tensions that had accumulated for many years in Iran began to turn into open nationwide upheavals, and in that context, Ruhollah Khomeini, from his exile in France, gradually became the symbolic center of a forming movement. One of the most shocking events occurred on the 19th of August, 1978, when the Cinema Rex Theatre in Abadan was set on fire, causing more than 400 people to die in one of the largest civilian disasters in modern Iran. The exact cause of the incident remains controversial, but in a society already full of dissatisfaction, many quickly blamed the government, seeing it as evidence of the brutality or helplessness of the ruling system. This event became a powerful catalyst, fueling a wave of protests that spread from major cities to rural areas with increasing scale and intensity. In Tehran and urban centers such as Isfahan, Shiraz, and Tabriz, protests took place continuously, often starting from prayer sessions or religious gatherings and quickly turning into marches against the government. Groups of students, merchants, in traditional bazaars, and the clerical class all participated, creating a broad alliance between social classes that previously did not always share common goals. Alongside the protests, strikes also occurred on a wide scale, especially in the oil industry, the main source of revenue for Iran's economy. Strikes in this sector not only disrupted economic activity, but also weakened the government's financial capacity, making it more difficult to maintain order and control the situation. Meanwhile, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi's health condition continued to deteriorate. The Shah had been diagnosed with cancer earlier, but this information was not widely publicized at the time. However, signs of his physical and mental decline gradually became evident in the way he governed the country. Decisions became inconsistent, and the government constantly changed strategies, sometimes trying to suppress with force, other times seeking to appease with political concessions. The instability in this response further increased the feeling that the system was gradually losing control. In that context, the image of Khomeini at Neauphle-le-Château appeared more and more on international media. His speeches were broadcast, interviews were published in Western newspapers, and their content was quickly translated and sent back to Iran through previously established networks. For many people inside the country, Khomeini was no longer just an exiled cleric, but a representative of the change they desired. Slogans in the protests increasingly mentioned his name, and his image began to appear on banners, posters, and in the speeches of movement participants. By the end of 1978, the situation had reached a point where traditional control measures were no longer effective. Security forces, including the army and police, were deployed to suppress protests, But in many cases, the use of force only increased opposition. Some military units began to show hesitation in carrying out suppression orders, and morale within these forces was no longer unified. Meanwhile, strikes continued to spread, disrupting basic services and making daily life unstable. In January of 1979, under increasing pressure from both inside and outside the country, the Shah decided to leave Iran. On the 16th of January 1979, he and the Queen boarded a plane and left the country, officially ending his presence in Iran after many decades in power. His initial destination was Egypt, and although he officially declared it was only a temporary trip, many realized that this was a sign that his power had ended. The Shah's departure created a large power vacuum, while various political forces had not yet reached agreement on how to fill that vacuum. A temporary government was established with the goal of maintaining order and preparing for a power transition process. But this government's ability to control the situation was limited. Their decisions were often challenged by protest groups on the streets, and in many cases, they did not have enough power or support to enforce policies. Meanwhile, messages from Khomeini continued to be transmitted from France, shaping people's expectations of a new system and reinforcing his role as the spiritual center of the movement. The combination of large-scale protests, economic strikes, the weakening of the current leadership, and the emergence of a figure capable of uniting opposition forces created a situation in which different factors simultaneously pushed the current system to its limit. What happened in 1978 and early 1979 was not the result of a single event, but the convergence of many factors that had accumulated over many years. And in that context, the ideas and messages developed during Khomeini's exile found an environment in which they could be transformed into real action. In the context of an increasingly evident power vacuum after Mohammad Reza Pahlavi left Iran, all eyes gradually turned to the moment when Ruhollah Khomeini would return. On the 1st of February 1979, the flight from Paris landed in Tehran, bringing him back after 15 years in exile. This event was not only of personal significance, but immediately became a political turning point. Millions of people poured into the streets to welcome him, and in that context, his presence in Iran created a new power center that existed in parallel with the temporary government established after the Shah's departure. The temporary government, headed by Prime Minister Shapur Bakhtiar, was designed as a transitional solution to maintain order and facilitate a reform process. However, right from when Khomeini returned, the legitimacy of this government was questioned. Just a few days after setting foot in Iran, Khomeini publicly declared that he did not recognize the Bakhtiar government and would establish a revolutionary government to replace it. This decision led to the simultaneous existence of two power systems. One side was the temporary government inherited from the old structure, and the other side was the revolutionary government being formed under Khomeini's leadership. To make his declaration concrete, Khomeini appointed Mehdi Bazargan as the head of the revolutionary government, a move aimed at creating a parallel executive apparatus that could directly compete with the current administration. This appointment was not only symbolic but also a strategic step, as Bazargan was seen as a figure with credibility who could attract support from various groups in society. However, the existence of two governments at the same time increased instability, as state agencies, security forces, and the military faced the question of which side they should follow orders from. In the following days, the situation on the streets continued to escalate. Protests not only continued but grew in scale, with participation from many social classes. State agencies, radio and television stations, and military facilities became targets of revolutionary groups who sought to control these power centers. Clashes between forces loyal to the old government and Khomeini supporters occurred in many areas, creating an environment where the line between order and chaos became blurred. One decisive factor in this period was the attitude of the army. Initially, the army was seen as the force that could maintain power for the temporary government, but over time, unity within this force began to weaken. Some units showed unwillingness to use force against protesters, while others lost contact or did not receive clear instructions. On the 11th of February 1979, the army officially declared neutrality, a decision that was a turning point that completely changed the balance of power. The army's withdrawal from its role supporting the old government meant that the system no longer had tools to maintain power. Immediately after the army's declaration of neutrality, the remaining agencies of the old government quickly lost control. Government headquarters were occupied, security agencies dissolved or switched to support the revolutionary side, and key figures of the temporary government lost the ability to govern. The 11th of February 1979 was seen as the moment when the old government completely collapsed, marking the end of a system that had existed for many decades. However, the collapse of the old government did not mean that a new system was established immediately. During this period, many different political factions began to compete to shape Iran's future. Left-wing groups, various Islamic organizations, Democrats and nationalists all had their own views on how the country should be managed. This diversity created a complex political environment where no single force could easily impose its views without facing opposition. In that context, Khomeini's position became particularly important. Unlike other groups, he did not rely only on a specific political program, but also on a vast religious network and an image built over many years as a spiritual leader. This allowed him to attract support from many different classes, from clerics and merchants to people participating in street protests. His decisions and statements in this period had a direct impact on how events unfolded, as many viewed him as a source of guidance in an environment full of instability. The establishment of the revolutionary government and the collapse of the old government in a period of only 10 days created a situation in which power was no longer bound by previous structures. In that space, Khomeini and his supporters had the ability to shape the next steps without facing an equally organized opponent. These developments not only changed the power structure in Iran, but also created a precedent for how a movement could transition from resistance to seizing power in a very short time when political, social, and military conditions converged in a certain direction. After the old system collapsed in February of 1979, the power vacuum was quickly filled, but not in the direction of a broad consensus among the factions that had joined together to overthrow the previous regime. In the following weeks and months, political groups that had once stood together in the anti-Shah movement began to reveal deep differences in goals and visions for Iran's future. Left-wing organizations, secular groups, nationalists, and Islamic forces with different views all sought to shape the new system. However, in that context, Ruhollah Khomeini and the network of clerics supporting him gradually gained the upper hand, not only thanks to religious influence but also thanks to the ability to organize and control the power mechanisms being formed. One of the first tools established to consolidate power was the system of revolutionary courts. These courts were set up right after the revolution with the goal of trying those considered to have ties to the old regime or seen as opponents of the new system. Unlike traditional courts, trials here often took place quickly, with simple procedures and little opportunity for the accused to defend themselves. In many cases, sentences were issued after just a few hours or a few days, and punishments could include the death penalty. High-ranking officials of the old regime, military officers, members of the security forces, and those accused of cooperating with Savak were the first targets brought to trial. However, the scope of these trials quickly expanded to include those suspected of holding views incompatible with the direction of the new system. In the period from 1979 to 1981, purges took place at many different levels. Initially, the main goal was to eliminate remnants of the old regime, but over time, groups that had once been allies in the revolution also began to become targets for elimination. Left-wing organizations, including groups linked to Marxist thought, had their activities restricted, and in many cases were dissolved. Secular politicians who had once supported a more democratic state model were gradually pushed out of positions of power. Even within Islamic forces, views that did not fully align with Khomeini's line were not accepted. This process did not occur in a single event, but as a series of successive actions that gradually narrowed the political space and eliminated alternative options. Alongside controlling political opponents, the media system was also restructured. Newspapers, radio, and television, which had already been under control during the Shah's time, continued to be placed under tight supervision, but with a different orientation. Media content was adjusted to reflect the values of the new system, and dissenting views were restricted or eliminated. newspapers with critical or dissenting tendencies toward the government were closed, while other media outlets were required to adhere to principles set by the state and religious authorities. This created an information environment in which official messages were reinforced and opposing voices had little chance to reach the public. In that context, power became increasingly concentrated in the hands of Khomeini and a small group of influential clerics. Important decisions, not only related to policy, but also to the structure of the state, were made with his direct or indirect involvement. The role of civilian agencies, although still existing formally, was gradually limited when compared to the influence of religious institutions. The drafting of the new constitution, approved through a referendum at the end of 1979, formalized the position of supreme leader, granting this title superior power over other branches of government. In that system, Khomeini was not only a spiritual symbol, but also the one with the final say in many important matters. These changes were also reflected in everyday social life. Regulations related to personal behavior, dress, and public activities were adjusted to conform to religious norms. New agencies were established to monitor compliance with these regulations, and the role of religion in public space was significantly expanded. Education, law, and other areas of social life were gradually reshaped according to Sharia principles, creating a system in which the boundary between religion and state was no longer as clear as before. In this process, those who had participated in the revolution with expectations of a more diverse system began to realize that space for differing views was increasingly narrowing. Some chose to adapt to the new system, while others sought to withdraw from political life or faced consequences for continuing to express their views. The events in this period showed that the transition from a revolutionary movement to a stable political system was not a linear process, but involved many adjustment steps, in which determining who was allowed to participate in the system became a central factor. The concentration of power and the elimination of political opponents not only shaped the structure of the new state, but also influenced the way Iranian society operated in the following years. The institutions built during this period, from revolutionary courts to social oversight agencies, continue to play an important role in maintaining order according to the definition of the new system. Meanwhile, Khomeini's image as a leader, not only in religion but also in politics, was reinforced through the decisions and actions that took place during this time, as he and those around him gradually shaped a governance model in which power was concentrated and controlled in a way different from what had existed before. After the phase of purges and elimination of opposing forces, the process of shaping a new state structure began to accelerate with clear institutional steps. In March of 1979, a nationwide referendum was held to decide the future political form of Iran. The official results showed that the majority of voters supported the establishment of the Islamic Republic, a model combining elements of a modern state with a Shia religious foundation. This referendum was not only of legal significance but was also used as a tool to consolidate legitimacy for the system being built under Ruhollah Khomeini's leadership, as it demonstrated a broad level of support from the public for the country's new direction. Following that, the drafting and approval of the new constitution became the central step in defining the power structure. The constitution, approved at the end of 1979, established a system in which the position of supreme leader held a superior role compared to other branches of government. This title, held by Khomeini, was not only symbolic but came with real power in many areas, from foreign policy and defense to the appointment of important positions in the judicial and media systems. While agencies such as the president and parliament still existed, their authority was placed within a framework, subject to supervision and guidance from the supreme leadership position, creating a structure in which democratic and theocratic elements coexisted but did not have equal levels of influence. Alongside building the legal framework, enforcement institutions were also established to ensure that the new system could maintain and protect itself. In May of 1979, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was formed as an organization parallel to the traditional army. Unlike the army, which had a history tied to the old regime, this force was designed to be directly loyal to the principles of the revolution and to the supreme leader. Their role was not limited to the military field, but also extended to internal security, protecting the political system and in many cases participating in economic and social activities. The existence of two armed forces with different functions reflected the new system's effort to create internal control mechanisms and minimize the possibility of challenges recurring from old institutions. In the field of law, the principles of Sharia law began to be integrated into the national legal system. Regulations related to criminal, civil, and family matters were adjusted to align with religious interpretations, and religious courts played an increasingly important role in trials. This process did not happen all at once, but step by step. But the general trend was a shift from a secular legal system to one in which religious norms played a foundational role. This not only affected how cases were handled, but also how social norms were defined and enforced in daily life, along with the changes in institutions and law. Khomeini's image in society was also reshaped in the direction of becoming a leader not only in politics, but also spiritually. His speeches were broadcast widely, his image appeared in public spaces, and his messages were integrated into education, media, and social activities. For many people, he was not only the head of state, but also the representative of the moral and religious values that the new system aimed for. This process was not mere imposition, but was built on the image that had been formed over many years before, when he was still in the exile period. The combination of religion and politics in the new model was not only expressed at the leadership level, but also spread to the lower levels of the system. Social, educational, and cultural organizations were adjusted to reflect the principles of the Islamic Republic, and the role of clerics in public life was expanded. In many cases, political decisions were interpreted through a religious lens, creating an approach in which governance issues were not only considered based on efficiency or benefit, but also on the degree of compatibility with moral and religious principles. In that context, the boundary between state and religion became increasingly difficult to distinguish. Political institutions did not operate independently of religious bodies, and conversely, religious decisions could have a direct impact on state policy. This model created a system in which power was not only determined by political position, but also by religious authority, and in which the role of the supreme leader became the intersection point of these two fields. What was built during this period was not only a new government, but a way of organizing society and power based on a set of principles different from the model that had existed before, laying the foundation for the way Iran operated in the following decades. Less than a year after the new system was established, Iran entered a large-scale conflict whose impact was not limited to the borders, but also shaped the entire direction of the country in the following years. In September of 1980, Saddam Hussein ordered the Iraqi army to cross the border, launching the Iran-Iraq War with the initial goal of taking advantage of the instability after the revolution to gain strategic advantage and control disputed areas. The attack quickly expanded into a full-scale war that lasted for 8 years and became one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 20th century, with estimates of more than 1 million people killed on both sides. In the early stage, Iraqi forces achieved some successes by advancing deep into Iranian territory and occupying areas along the border. However, the Iranian army, although it had just undergone restructuring after the revolution and lost many experienced officers, gradually reorganized and carried out counter-offensive campaigns. In the context of shortages of equipment and resources compared to the opponent, Iran deployed some tactics based on large numbers of soldiers, including campaigns described as human waves. Units, including young volunteer forces, were mobilized to participate in direct attacks aimed at breaking through Iraqi defensive lines. These tactics, in some cases, helped Iran regain lost territory, but at the same time also led to very heavy casualties. Throughout the war, Ruhollah Khomeini maintained a central role in directing policy and maintaining fighting spirit. His speeches emphasized the defensive nature of the war, while linking it to religious values and the duty to protect the country. When Iraq, after initial failures, began seeking diplomatic solutions and offering ceasefires from the early 1980s, Iran did not accept immediately. For many years, Khomeini and other leaders argued that continuing the fight was necessary to ensure long-term security and achieve broader goals, including weakening Iraq's military capabilities. This decision prolonged the war and at the same time increased the human and material costs for both sides. At home, the war created a context in which control and mobilization measures were expanded. The economy was adjusted to serve war needs, and many areas of social life were directly affected by the conflict. At the same time, security mechanisms continued to operate to ensure that there was no significant opposition to the state's policy. During this period, internal purges did not completely end, but continued at varying levels, especially targeting groups considered opposition or incompatible with the system's direction. By 1988, when the war had lasted nearly a decade, the situation began to change. Both sides suffered heavy losses, and the ability to sustain conflict at a high level became more difficult. In the same year, a series of domestic events led to increased control measures, including the handling of political prisoners considered linked to opposition groups. These actions took place in the context of the system seeking to consolidate internal stability when facing pressure from both the battlefield and the economy. Finally, in August of 1988, Iran accepted the ceasefire agreement under United Nations Resolution 598, ending the war with Iraq. This decision was made after many years of rejecting similar offers, reflecting a change in the assessment of the strategic situation and the ability to continue the war. The conflict ended without significant border changes, but left far-reaching consequences for both countries, from human losses to economic and social impacts. Throughout this entire period, the war was not only a military event, but also a factor shaping the way the political system operated. Decisions made in the context of conflict had a direct influence on the power structure, the level of social control, and the way the state interacted with the people. The war years created an environment in which priorities for security and stability were placed first, and in that environment, the role of the supreme leader became closely tied to directing not only military policy, but also the entire direction of the nation. After the war with Iraq ended in 1988, Ruhollah Khomeini's image in the eyes of the public was not only linked to political and military decisions, but also shaped by the way he lived and appeared in daily life. Contrary to the image of a leader holding supreme power in a centralized system, Khomeini chose to live in Jamaran, a relatively simple area in northern Tehran. His residence was not a palace or luxurious complex, but a simple house with enough space for daily living and receiving guests. Images recorded during this time often showed him sitting on the carpet in a room without elaborate decoration, receiving officials or scholars. This choice of residence and lifestyle was viewed by many as part of the message he wanted to convey, that power did not necessarily have to come with luxury, and that a religious leader should keep distance from material displays. In his personal life, Khomeini married Khadijeh Sakofi when he was young, and they had 7 children together. His family, although living in a special context when he became the leader of the country, was still described as maintaining a relatively discreet lifestyle. His wife rarely appeared in public, and information about family life was not widely publicized. Among the children, Ahmad Khomeini played the most prominent role in political activities, often seen as a close assistant and a bridge between Khomeini and agencies in the system. Ahmad not only conveyed his father's messages and decisions, but also participated in coordinating political activities, especially during periods when Khomeini's health began to decline. Although he was the head of the system, Khomeini did not appear frequently in public in the way many other political leaders did. His appearances were mainly linked to important speeches, religious occasions, or events of special significance to the nation. Most of the time, he operated in his private space, where meetings were held on a limited scale and content was controlled. This created a certain distance between him and the public, while contributing to reinforcing his image as a figure not caught up in everyday political activities, but standing in a higher position in the system. Khomeini's daily routine was described as regular and disciplined. He devoted time to prayer, reading religious texts, studying, and writing. These activities not only reflected his role as a religious scholar, but also served as a way for him to maintain continuity with the period before he became involved in politics. Even while holding the leadership role, he still reserved a large part of his time for personal and spiritual activities rather than directly participating in every aspect of state management. This did not mean he was detached from political decisions, but was the way he chose to fulfill his role through established channels and mechanisms. Khomeini's image of morality and discipline was reinforced not only through his personal lifestyle, but also through the way he was presented in the media and official documents. His speeches often emphasized values such as responsibility, sacrifice, and adherence to religious principles. Images and stories about his simple life were widely circulated and became part of the way the system built and maintained public support. For many people, especially system supporters, the consistency between his words and his way of living was an important factor in building trust. However, maintaining this image was also tied to the way information was controlled and selected for release. Aspects of his personal life that did not fit the general image were rarely mentioned, while details that reinforced the image of morality and simplicity were emphasized. This was not uncommon in political systems, but in Khomeini's case, it helped create an image in which the individual and the political role were closely intertwined. In the final years of his life, as his health began to decline, the role of those around him, especially Ayatollah Khomeini, became more important in maintaining the system's operations. Decisions continued to be made in Khomeini's name, but the process of communication and implementation increasingly depended on his close associates. Nevertheless, his image as a spiritual and political leader was maintained, and elements of his personal life, from the way he lived, the way he worked, to the way he appeared in public, continued to play a role in shaping how he was perceived in Iranian society at that time. In the late 1980s, as the system that Ruhollah Khomeini had built entered a more stable phase after the war, his health condition began to become an increasingly important factor in Iran's political life. From the middle of this decade, signs of physical decline appeared more clearly. He suffered serious cardiovascular problems and underwent multiple treatments and surgeries. Although information about his health condition was not publicly released in detail, within the system, preparations for the possibility of a power transition had already begun. As it became clear that his time was limited, during this period the role of close associates, especially his son Ahmad Khomeini, became more prominent in conveying information and coordinating daily activities. Important decisions continued to be made in Khomeini's name, but the implementation process increasingly depended on the network of people around him. At the same time, agencies within the system also began discussing the issue of succession, a complex question in a context where no single figure could easily replace his position both religiously and politically. By early 1989, Khomeini's health condition became more serious. He was hospitalized in Tehran for surgery, and although doctors tried to prolong his life, subsequent complications prevented his body from recovering. On the 3rd of June 1989, Khomeini passed away, ending nearly a decade in the position of Supreme Leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran. News of his death was quickly announced and spread nationwide, creating a strong reaction from the public. His funeral took place in the following days and was considered one of the largest gatherings in modern Iranian history. Millions of people from all over the country flocked to Tehran to attend, many of them viewing their presence at the event as a spiritual duty or an opportunity to express respect for the person they saw as their leader. However, the enormous scale of the crowd also led to situations that were difficult to control. When Khomeini's body was brought out for the public to see one last time, the crowd pressed too close, creating chaos. At some points, security forces could not maintain order, and recorded images showed scenes of pushing and shoving as many people tried to approach the coffin. In the end, the funeral had to be reorganized with tighter control measures to ensure that the ceremony could be completed. Alongside the funeral rites, the process of selecting a successor took place quickly to avoid a prolonged power vacuum. The assembly of experts, the body with authority to appoint the supreme leader, was convened to make the decision. After discussions, Ali Khamenei, who had previously held the position of president, was chosen as the successor. This decision sparked some debate, especially regarding his religious qualifications compared to traditional standards for the position. However, In the context of ensuring continuity and stability of the system, the choice of Khomeini was seen as an acceptable solution for the majority of the council members. The power transition took place in a relatively short period, reflecting the system's effort to avoid instability that could arise from a leadership change. The institutions built throughout the previous decade, from the constitution to security and political agencies, continued to function under the new leadership, albeit with certain adjustments. Meanwhile, Khomeini's image, from an exiled cleric who became the leader of a revolution and the head of a state, was further reinforced through the way he was remembered after his death. The events that occurred in the final days of his life and immediately afterward not only marked the end of an individual, but also an important transition point for the system he had helped build. The way this process was handled, from the release of information, the organization of the funeral, to the selection of a successor, reflected the extent to which the institutions had been prepared to deal with a situation that had been anticipated, but whose exact timing could not be determined. In that context, Khomeini's passing became a milestone, not only in his personal history, but also in the history of modern Iran, as one era ended and a new one began under the leadership of his successor. After Ruhollah Khomeini passed away in 1989 and power was transferred to Ali Khamenei, the system he established did not disintegrate but continued to operate, adapt, and survive through many fluctuations in the region and the world. More than 4 decades after the 1979 revolution, the core principles of the Islamic Republic, the combination of religion and politics, the central role of the supreme leader, and the network of institutions built to protect the system remain the foundation of modern Iran. This shows that Khomeini's legacy lies not only in the events he directly participated in, but also in the power structure he helped shape, a structure capable of maintaining and reproducing itself through multiple generations of leadership. For a portion of the Iranian people and those who support the system, Khomeini is viewed as a figure who liberated the country from excessive Western influence, especially in the period before the revolution, when Iran was a close ally of the United States in the context of the Cold War. From this perspective, the revolution was not only a political change, but also an effort to restore cultural and religious identity, bringing decision-making power back into the hands of Iranians instead of depending on external powers. Those who hold this view often emphasize Iran's ability to maintain independence in foreign policy, as well as its capacity to resist international pressures for many decades. However, another perspective argues that the system built under Khomeini established a high level of control over political and social life. From security agencies and the judicial system to media and education, many areas were organized in a way that limited space for opposing views. Those who hold this view argue that the concentration of power in a single position, combined with the merging of religious and political authority, created an environment in which mechanisms for checks and balances on power were limited. Events in the years after the revolution, from the initial purges to the control of protest movements, are often cited as evidence of how the system operated. Throughout more than 40 years since it was established, this system has faced many challenges both from within and from outside. In foreign affairs, Iran has continued to face economic sanctions from many countries, especially related to issues such as the nuclear program and the country's role in regional conflicts. These measures have had a significant impact on the economy, affecting the living standards of the people and the ability to develop in certain areas. Domestically, issues such as unemployment, inflation, and social inequality remain challenges that the system must confront. Protests that have occurred at various times show that not all groups in society fully agree with the current direction. Nevertheless, the system's ability to survive for such a long period also shows that it has certain adaptive mechanisms. Elections, although limited in the range of candidates, still create a degree of rotation in political positions. Economic and foreign policies have been adjusted in different periods, reflecting changes in the international environment and domestic needs. In that context, Khomeini's legacy is not a static entity, but a system that continues to develop and transform over time. The question of how to evaluate Khomeini, therefore, does not have a simple answer. For some people, he is the figure who changed Iran's history, leading a movement from an opposition position to seizing power and building a new system. For others, he can be seen as a product of specific historical conditions, dissatisfaction with the old regime, the influence of international factors, and the role of religion in Iranian society, factors that created an environment in which a revolution became possible. In this view, Khomeini was not the sole cause of the change, but the one who took advantage of and directed the existing currents. These debates continue to exist not only in academic circles, but also in Iran's current political and social life. His legacy is mentioned in discussions about the future of the country, about the extent to which the current system should be maintained or reformed, and about how Iran positions itself in the world. In that context, Khomeini's image, both as a religious leader and as a political figure, remains an important point of reference, even though the way he is perceived may differ depending on the perspective and experience of each group in society. The story of Ruhollah Khomeini shows a profound lesson about how power forms and transforms in times of instability. From a cleric exiled in 1964, he utilized religious networks, hand-passed cassette tapes in the 1970s, and social dissatisfaction after the Cinema Rex event in 1978 to build influence without directly controlling territory. When he returned on the 1st of February 1979, in just 10 days, he transformed a dispersed movement into concentrated power, especially when the army declared neutrality on the 11th of February 1979. However, what happened afterward? The revolutionary courts, the purges from 1979 to 1981, media control, and the Vilayati Faqih system shows a familiar pattern. Revolutions may begin with promises of liberation, but easily end in the concentration of power if there are no mechanisms for checks and balances. Even during the 8-year Iran-Iraq War, with more than 1 million people killed and the repeated rejection of peace offers for many years, we see how one individual's decisions can shape the fate of an entire nation. For the American people, the lesson is not in comparing systems, but in understanding the value of institutions that check power, freedom of the press, and transparency, factors that help prevent one individual or a small group from shaping the entire system. At the same time, the story also reminds us that unresolved social discontent can become a driving force for major changes, but the direction of that change depends on how power is organized after the initial goals are achieved. If you want to continue exploring turbulent historical stories like the journey of Ruhollah Khomeini, please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next in-depth analyses. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where we continue to ask questions about power, history, and the people who have changed the world.